Hello and welcome along. Today we're going to talk about the Death Guard and what they were doing before they were reunited with Mortarion. Talking about the Death Guard takes us back to Old Albia, which is a region of Terra that roughly approximates to the UK in our world. So Old Albia is a part of Terra where 3 legions were actually raised, or at least initially. So the Night Lords famously were raised from the prison system. The Iron Hands were also raised from the population of Old Albia, but the legion that had the greatest contribution from the population of Old Albia were the Death Guard, or as they were known shortly after this time, the Dusk Raiders. They weren't initially called that, they were just called the 14th Legion. Most legions were just called by their number when they were first created. They did eventually pick up the name Dusk Raiders, which we'll go into shortly, but weren't named the Death Guard until they were reunited with Mortarion, and he named them that after his sort of band of followers that he built up on Barbarous, is the world he landed on. So going back to Old Albia, this was a population that was extremely important in Old Terra. So they had built up their own empire. They had fought against the enemies of the Imperium, the Trans-Pacific Empire. As allies of the Emperor, they actually fought and defeated this Pan-Pacific Empire. Eventually, though, they did become enemies of the Emperor, simply because they were unwilling to bow down and accept his overall leadership, because they were a very proud population, and they had considerable military success themselves, so they didn't think that they should. Now, this led to a war with the Emperor, where they fought extremely well, and eventually led to a kind of a stalemate, where the Emperor realized that to eventually win would cause massive losses to his own forces, and would basically waste this great resource of this population that had impressed him in the way that they fought and their industry, what they had created. And so he personally appealed to them in a diplomatic mission to join him, and eventually together they could have new glories in the stars. That's how he put it. The warlords of Old Albia agreed that this would be actually the right thing to do, which was something of a surprise to people who around the Emperor, who didn't believe that it was possible to persuade them, but they did. And although they joined the Emperor and became actually very, very quite loyal and important members within this new organization, this new proto-empire, those closest to the Emperor still did find them a little bit suspicious, and they weren't willing to fully embrace them. But also the Emperor argued that one of the ways to reduce the likelihood of a former enemy rebelling against you is to take their best and brightest and recruit them into your organizations. So with their prime human resources going into the legions, into other imperial organizations, they weren't there to then fight you. They were doing your fighting for you, and so that's what he did, and it worked extremely well. So the Death Guard, as I said, took the most recruits and were the legion most influenced by the culture of Old Albia. And this culture really was built around heavy infantry, or at least their war culture. And this transferred over to the proto Death Guard, as we can call them. So they built their tactics really about using heavy infantry. The kind of warfare that the Death Guard became famous for during this period was essentially wave after wave of infantry just relentlessly marching towards you and eventually defeating you. So whereas other legions specialize in very rapid, fast, brutal strikes, you can think of people like the World Eaters, the Space Wolves, Blood Angels. The Death Guard were slow but relentless. So you think more of sort of the World War One type battlefield, where ranks upon ranks of soldiers would just stand up out of a trench and march slowly across the no man's land into the face of the enemy guns, or Napoleonic warfare, where you've got ranks of infantry just standing there and firing volleys at each other. It's the relentless nature of those attacks that made them work. They just kept coming. You might shoot some of them, some of them might go down, and in the case of the Death Guard, you might shoot them and they just get back up and start coming again. Because they were very tough. Even from the early days, they were renowned for being extremely durable. The tactic was that you would shoot some of them, some would go down, but there would always be someone to step into the line and keep coming. So it was created a kind of psychological effect that was different to some of the ways the other legions would terrify their enemies into defeat, but it was just as effective. So you might get overwhelmed or shocked or surprised by a force like the Space Wolves attacking you, and you would feel obviously instants of terror, but that would pass very quickly. You'd either be dead or that was over, or you might get lucky and you killed them. So, but with the Death Guard, you'd be shooting them and killing them, or even at least you might think you're killing them. Some of them, most of them, are probably going to get back up, but even the ones you did kill were going to be replaced. And so it was this slow, relentless drive across the battlefield, which just where the feeling of dread and hopelessness would just build up inside the enemy force, as they was like, well, there's nothing I can do. Eventually, they're going to get to me, and eventually they're going to kill me. It's kind of like the effect of a horror film bad guy who doesn't pop out of nowhere. It's not like the cheap scare, a jump scare, like jumping out of a cupboard or something. It's just like he's in the distance and okay, we've just got to get away. So, but you get away a bit and then you turn around and they're still there. But they're a bit closer, and then they're still there, but they're a bit closer. And no matter how far you run, no matter how far you get away, they're always there, and they're always getting closer and closer. And eventually they're going to get you. You know that, and that feeling of dread, of terror, is what the Death Guard worked on. That was their tactic. And they did it extremely well. So they ended up doing it so well that they were highly admired among the imperial hierarchy. Even primarchs admired them for their method of war. And they basically became the ultimate anvil in a hammer-anvil tactic. So if you think of the hammer-and-anvil tactic, essentially you pin your enemy with your anvil, which is something that they can just attack and drive against, hit against, and not really make much progress. And then you hit them with a swift hammer, which is the rapid movement, a strike of a heavy armored force, or an air assault, or something that just smashes them from a flank or the rear, and then you destroy them like that. It's a very tried and tested tactic that's used in warfare for many cultures and periods, and in the 40k world, it's very famously used a lot by Space Marine legions. So often they might use another force, like some Imperial army, to be the anvil. You just basically sacrifice them because you don't worry too much about them dying. And then the Legion is the rapid-moving Iron Fist, the hammer that smashes them from some unexpected angle with massive ferocity. Now, the Iron Hands were actually famous for developing this tactic amongst the legions, and they initially used Imperial army troops to be the anvil. But Ferrus Manus himself actually comments that he thought that the Death Guard were the legion he would most want to have with him, guarantee defeating an enemy, and the legion he'd least like to have on the opposing side. So because he admired them a lot, because, well, one, he liked the hammer and anvil tactic, which was, as I said, developed by the Iron Hands, although before he joined them. Two, he loved the way that they were basically like robots. There was no sign of emotion in the way they fought. He liked troops to be predictable and like robots. Also admired the fact that, when they would attack, that it was just relentless. It would just keep going on and on and on until they ground down an enemy to nothing. Though the general personality of a Death Guard was very stoic, so they were not prone to bouts of temper. They would never break. They would never get nervous. They would never get anxious. They would just do a job to the best of their abilities, but without any. They didn't have like flair or style like some of the other legions might have. They weren't going to do anything particularly buoyant or out of the box. They aren't going to pull out of a random tactic. They weren't going to do anything weird or unpredictable. They weren't going to defeat an enemy by some unknown random tactic they'd invented on the spot that you might get from some of the other legions. But if you give them the job, they're going to do it well, and eventually they will win, even if it means taking quite a long time to do it, because they don't really care too much about speed. And that's what they did. They became the specialists at this kind of heavy infantry tactics, where you just keep going, keep driving forwards at a slow but steady pace that cannot be stopped. Now, they also like the tactic of attacking at night, or just before the night sets in, so at dusk. And this is basically where they got the title, the Dust Raiders. So they felt that it was a way of adding to that psychological impact on the enemy. So you're just seeing them rising up and starting to drive, starting to advance upon the enemy, slowly coming across the battlefield at dusk, where it kind of plays tricks with you, the light, and it added to their sort of mystery and the feeling of fear and dread that an enemy might have. The Dust Raiders coming. For that, they got this title, the Dust Raiders, from that people around them, the allies that they were fighting with, Imperial Army, maybe other Astartes, started calling them that because of this tactic that they like to use. Now, also, one of the things that they carried over into Legion tradition from the culture of Old Albia was this kind of honor code. So they were very honorable in that once they made agreements, they stuck to them. They weren't tricked. They weren't kind of people that you could be deceived by. And that was important to them, as that they were kind of bound by their word, which went back to this kind of noble tradition of Old Albia. Obviously, they also took many of the prejudices that people of Terra had, and particularly Old Albia. They had no time for people like mutants and aliens. But then that, to be fair, that can be applied to most of the legions, because that's heavily indoctrinated into the culture of the Legion. So that's not particularly unusual, but they were slightly more, shall we say, more xenophobic in the truest sense of the word. So hating aliens and hating the different. And this you can see carry over into the Death Guard when Mortarion joins them, who himself has a intense hatred for aliens, psychers in particular, but mutants. He doesn't like them because of his history on Barbarous. Perhaps also is part of his gene seed as well, and also it's part of the culture of Old Albia as well. So that kind of all comes together serendipitously. And this is something that's a recurring theme within the legions when you look at their history, is that their early history often has foreshadowing of their time with their primarchs. So the primarchs, not just because of the link of the gene seed, but often there's like a cultural link between the planets, the area of Old Terra and the planet that the Primarch lands on, and there's quite strong cultural connections. And this can be put down to either, it depends how cynical you are, this can be put down to bad writing in the early days of the Warhammer 40k writing, where they kind of mixed up things which shouldn't have been happening until their Primarch was with the Legion, and then they kind of had to make up reasons for it later. But or you can say that it's kind of like, well, everything is connected through the warp, everything has reasons, and there's always sort of layers of connection between these things. And so the fact that Primarchs landed on planets that led them to be brought up in cultures that mirrored the recruits that were being brought up on Terra, and their culture that they have been brought up on, is actually to do with that connection, that kind of mystical warp connections and plannings of the deep sort of layered plans of chaos and the Emperor, and interwoven and so on. So you do see this all the time within the history of the legions, and that is the Warhammer 40k world. The warp is a strange place. So the Dust Raiders, they were really a loyal legion. They were very, very strongly bound by their code of honor. They were very, as we said, stoic. They weren't prone to treachery in some of the ways some of the other legions that eventually went traitor were. And this could be seen in the fact that when they eventually did turn traitor, most of the Terran-born recruits who had been basically the old Dust Raiders before they'd become the Death Guard, did have to be killed off. So famously on Istvan 3, the traitor legions have to turn on their own side. So they create this situation where they need to attack this planetary governor as a traitor, and they send down a part of each legion to this battle as the first wave. But in fact, it's a trick, so that the first wave are actually all the loyalists in their three legions, and then they virus bomb them. That's the plan. It goes slightly wrong, which means they have to then do a landing, and then basically you've got the loyalist section of the legion have to try and fight for their lives against the traitor section with their primarchs. And of course, that's a losing battle because they're outnumbered and they're in a really bad situation already. There's a fleet above them, etc. So obviously they are essentially wiped out. I think there's a couple of famous survivors, but that's for another video. In the case of the Death Guard, though, they had to send down a third of the Legion. So about a third of the Legion were killed on Istvan 3 because they were too loyal. So you can see that it's deeply intertwined into their culture, this loyalist tradition. And really, the only ones that went traitor were the ones that were recruited on Barbarous that came, what they were molded by Mortarion in much more in his image, and were affected much more by the culture of Barbarous than of Terra. And there was this kind of divide within the Legion. And to be honest, that's another thread that continues. When you look at the Legions in general, there is quite often this relatively big divide between the Terran recruits and the later recruits that have come from the homeworlds of their primarchs. And some legions manage to reconcile this, some don't. And to be honest, the traitor legions generally don't, and that's what causes this need to purge the older recruits who will now form this kind of Terran core of the legion, and kind of don't actually. They're kind of split loyalties in some ways between the primarch and the emperor, and Terra and their new homeworlds. And they're always kind of seen as a little bit suspicious by the primarchs and the new recruits amongst the traitor legions. It'd be interesting. I think there are some loyalist legions that applies to as well, which actually we'll come to when we do those legions. But it is, I think, more of a problem in the traitor legion. When Mortarion joins, he does change the legion. As I said, the culture starts to change somewhat. It becomes much more focused around him and Barbarous and so on. But really, the way the Legion fights is the same. He just intensifies it. He likes the way that they are renowned for being extremely tough and durable. He likes the heavy infantry, the slow-moving, grinding assault tactics, and he just emphasizes that more. So he doesn't really change the Legion culture too much in the way that some of the Primarchs do. And they continue on, and eventually, of course, they did turn traitor, as I said. But there wasn't really any early signs of this ever happening in the Legion. I think it really is only Mortarion's joining them that causes this problem. And in fact, there was another interesting thing about the Legion, the Death Guard, is that Mortarion didn't actually join them till quite late. So they actually spent 80 years in the Great Crusade without Mortarion. He's one of the later Primarchs to be found. And that means they were on their own for quite a lot. And while a lot of the other Legions had now found their Primarchs. And that affects a legion, because when you've got a primarch, that's a big deal, because that's someone who's really immediately right at the top of the imperial hierarchy, who's in your corner, is batting for you, and is it makes it easier for a legion to get by. It makes them get more prestigious jobs. It gets them a higher profile. It gets more respect. And you've just got a massive combat monster who's suddenly joined you, can fight with you, and a genius tactician who can orchestrate your campaign. So you should be much better. But the Death Guard got on really well even without Mortarion, and was still doing well, being respected, not causing any problems. So I think that really says a lot for them as well, as how good they were just as an organisation. Even without a Primarch, they weren't really suffering. It also influenced their kind of culture to make them quite self-reliant and somewhat stubborn, but stubborn in a good way, kind of a prideful, stubborn pride that they would always carry on, get the job done, would have like they'd always done, regardless. So it didn't seem to be a problem for them. One last thing about the Legion: one of the greatest heroes and one of the most important heroes of the early sort of heresy period was Nathaniel Garro. Now, I think he was a battle captain of the Death Guard, and he deserves a video of his own. But just to say, he was critical in sort of the early days of bringing attention to the fact that the heresy had happened and what had gone on. And his character exemplifies everything that there is to be a Death Guard, or really should say a Dusk Raider, because this is what they were before Mortarion joined them, and it's that very stoic personality. It's all about duty and just doing your job, keeping on going, no matter how bad things are. You just keep going. It's the grind. He exemplifies the grind. He just grinds away all the time. And if something terrible, you've just lost an arm. Well, okay, well, so I've got to carry on, keep moving forward, doing my job. That's it. So there you go, the Death Guard, or the Dusk Raiders. I think an impressive legion, probably another legion that were ruined by their Primarch returning, but much more slowly than the others. So it was more of a slow progression towards treachery because of the flaws within Mortarion's personality, rather than a rapid change and organisational change or anything like that. Like, subscribe and share, and I will see you next time.